Toronto's streetcars have a problem. Okay, no, they have many problems. It's become abundantly clear to me, not just now, but over my entire time living in Toronto, that Torontonians have a very strange relationship with the streetcars. People are often proud that, unlike many cities around the world, we didn't rip the trams out. But on the other hand, almost everyone acknowledges how slow and inconsistent the network has become. Seriously, jokes about being able to walk faster than streetcar X or Y are a dime a dozen. And in recent years, things feel like they may have reached a turning point. Diversions all over the place, inconsistent and unreliable service. It's even got to the point where barely fake maps have shown up at stops with people venting their frustration artistically. Now, one way of solving this problem, potentially the fun way, is to spend a ton of money and build a ton of new things. And I do actually have a video that talks about that right up here. But this video is simple. It's about the basic things that we could change to make the streetcars better, and most of these things could basically be changed overnight. Not necessarily literally overnight, though in some cases that would be true, but as a policy change. Instead of doing things one way, when we do them a different way. That's because there are so many little things we could do to make the streetcars so much better, and yet we don't do them. The obvious question everyone asks when you say this is why? And as with most satisfying answers, the answer is probably, it depends. But one good potential answer here is that Toronto just has a fairly conservative culture in the traditional sense. To some extent, we probably kept the streetcars, or at least there was support to keep the streetcars, because doing so was conserving something from our past. But that same, sometimes good tendency leads us astray a lot. So let's take a look at how we could make things so much better. It's important to remember that the general theme of my channel is glass half full. And so I do want to start by saying at least Toronto has a streetcar network to mess up and now hopefully fix. At the same time, there are some legitimately positive features of today's streetcar network, from the relatively high frequencies to the really nice seamless integration with the subway at places like Union Station and Spadina. Not to mention the 24-hour operation, making it one of the few 24-hour rail systems in North America and in the world. The unfortunate thing is that's about where the major positives stop. So let's look at where the problems lie and some ways we could fix them. As an outsider, when I first moved to Toronto, one of the things I sort of found bothersome about the network was the numbering/naming scheme of the routes. It's not particularly clear as a newcomer why the routes are numbered as they are. 501, 506, etc. But that gets even worse when you look at a route like the 504 King, which has two different versions which aren't actually branches of one another, but which use the common branch naming convention of 504A and 504B. This gets even more egregious with routes like the 509 and 512, which are entirely in their own lanes, making them more consistent and reliable than other routes, and yet there would be no way of knowing that from their names or from the maps which they appear on. They look and sound just like any other route, despite being a step above. Suffice to say, a simplified but also more useful naming scheme, a la Paris for example, would be really useful. In that example, the routes are simply numbered T1, T2, etc. And express routes, which in Paris use tram trains but could potentially designate right-of-way routes in Toronto, are simply known as T11 Express or T12 Express. The 500 numbers for the streetcars feels like the prototypical way that we've kept something from the past, even if it doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense today. At the same time, it kind of amazes me how little attention we give to physical wayfinding on the streetcar network. Streetcars don't get anything more than buses, which is just a simple white pole with some numbers on it that is basically not helpful at all if you haven't previously Googled the route you're looking for or looked at a map. Ideally, the signage at streetcar stops, and bus stops for that matter, would give you more information, like you see in cities like Vancouver, telling you how frequent the route is and where it actually goes. And bigger, bolder, actually visible from a distance signs seem appropriate for the streetcar network, given it's meant to be a higher mode of transit. I think as with a lot of things, this will be a bit of a theme in this video, we could take inspiration from Melbourne here, who has better wayfinding and signage than us in general. Now the wayfinding on the vehicles could also be much better. We're ordering 60 new streetcars right now, low floor like the ones we have already, but despite the fact that this is an order that's being placed over 10 years since we placed the last order, I'm not sure that there's going to be any major design changes to the vehicles, despite the fact that LCD wayfinding screens are much more common now and would be super useful to provide more information while you're riding along a streetcar route. See these in London all over the place, for example. I also think that new vehicles should probably have Wi-Fi and USB ports. I certainly don't think that should be a primary feature that drives you to buy a new vehicle, but when you're buying new vehicles, having those features is just kind of nice. And transit systems around the world, again like London, but also like Waterloo's Ion, have features like Wi-Fi, and people use them and find them helpful. All of that being said, even the existing streetcars could be so much better if the announcements and actual information on the screens was programmed better. For example, when riding the 504 King this week, which as I mentioned, splits and goes in different directions, I hoped that there would be an announcement saying where the streetcar was actually headed, as you hear on basically every branch subway or metro system ever.
This train is for YDR Airport.
But there was no announcement, and of course the streetcar wasn't going in the direction I wanted, which meant I had to walk over a kilometer to get to the place I actually did want to go to. The announcements also don't make use of the time and the screens that we already have, so you don't get things like hearing what lines also connect at a major stop. For example, it would be good for announcements to say whether there's a regional train line or a major streetcar route available at a certain stop. Crazier still, when I was riding the 510 Spadina streetcar recently and heading into Union Station, I noticed that at Union it's announced that you can change for Via Rail, which probably should be called National Rail because it kind of makes it more obvious what's being referred to, but it also mentions Up Express, the airport train. Of course though, the largest user of Union Station, Go Transit with their Go trains that go all over the region, isn't actually mentioned, and this might seem like a minor deal. And if you're a regular user, it is a minor deal. But if you're a tourist who quite possibly could be riding this route, it's such a basic announcement to make so that people don't have to go ask an employee or ask a fellow rider if they're in the right place. And this is something we should just have. If you listen to the announcements or look at the maps for either Go Transit or the TTC, way too often it feels like they don't even acknowledge each other's existence. And taxpayers pay for both services, and transit riders use both services, and so the fact that that isn't included is silly. There's also the issue of diversions. When sections of the network need to be rebuilt, which I will note feels like more often than it probably should be given that newer construction methods are supposed to last longer, communication and even just general organization of the replacement service is incredibly hectic. From the numerous posters to inconsistent routing and the like, it would be great if there was a focus on simplicity and consistency and clarity for riders. Now, if you've ever had a conversation about the Toronto streetcars, particularly in urbanists and transit circles, you've probably heard about signal priority, where streetcars or other transit vehicles should get priority at lights, with longer greens and shorter reds. This is a super important topic, but it's way too big to include in this video, so I'll make a video about it in the future. One thing I do find crazy about signals is in a lot of places across the city where you have a loop or a station that's off the street and a streetcar needs to move from that station or loop onto the street, there's no dedicated signal to stop traffic. So the driver of the giant 30-meter multi-ton tram basically has to play chicken with drivers to edge their way out onto the street. This is crazy, especially at a major station like Bathurst, where I see it happening quite regularly. It seems obvious to me that the streetcar, which doesn't even come all that frequently, should have a dedicated signal that can be activated so that a red light starts for drivers and the streetcar can just seamlessly drive right out onto the tracks. Now, another element of traffic that creates a lot of problems for streetcars are left turns. And left turns need to be banned way more often. In some places, like major intersections on Spadina Avenue, for example, there are left turns and the left turns get priority over the streetcars actually going through the intersection. So as a rider, you typically have to wait 10 or so seconds at every single intersection for 4 or 5 cars to make a left turn before your streetcar, which is probably carrying like 100 passengers, trottles through the intersection. Not allowing that would force some drivers to take a slightly longer route, but they're sitting in their air-conditioned car listening to music, so they'll survive. But at the same time, if we're willing to be creative, which we should really be willing to do much more often, there are options so that people can still make their left turn. And for this, we can look to Melbourne once again with the hook turn, which is glorious. Basically what a hook turn is when making a turn across an intersection, instead of going to the middle and then turning across, you go to the far side of the intersection and pull over and line up with the cross traffic. That way, when the lights switch and the cross traffic is ready to go, you take a tight turn and then you head along with the cross traffic. And this is something that already exists in Toronto, only for cyclists. Unfortunately though, despite having those left turns that we do have on streets like Spadina, our signal lights are not sophisticated, especially, but perhaps unsurprisingly, for pedestrians. If you're on a street like Spadina and there's a left turn, there's no reason that pedestrians shouldn't be able to cross halfway along the street, since crossing like that doesn't interfere with left turning cars. But there's no separate pedestrian signal to allow people to cross the street early or go to the tram stop and get on the streetcar. This is something that should exist on any street that has a major center island or a streetcar median in the center. Another thing that would be incredibly powerful is more bans on through traffic, something in which you already see on the King Street Priority Corridor. Having this deployed at far more busy intersections would speed streetcars up a lot. Of course, it would need to be enforced, and right now, even on King Street, it isn't really enforced, and part of the time I'm not even sure drivers understand that they're not allowed to go straight through, since all that's used is some paint on the ground, which is often worn out. A better solution here would be to have some sort of rough paving material, perhaps even some concrete bumps, that are obvious to any driver that they're not supposed to drive over, but which the streetcar can seamlessly roll right through on its rails. And since they wouldn't be completely impossible to drive over, emergency vehicles would be fine anyways. Now, one of the most common things I get asked is why the aforementioned Spadina streetcar is so slow, and that one is a doozy. Basically, the TTC streetcar network entirely uses single point switches, which means that instead of a regular rail switch where you have two rails that switch, you only have the single inner rail which switches back and forth. Not only does this limit speed and create a rougher ride and increase the risk of literally derailing the streetcar, but it's not at all standard. Other cities in cold weather climates, from Oslo to Stockholm and even Toronto and other places, actually use dual point switches. But again, it seems that since we've long used single point switches, we've convinced ourselves that they're clearly better, even if it means substantial costs that we're taking on every day, like having a major route like Spadina that goes through a lot of switches be painfully slow because they're all single point. That's actually another interesting conversation though. If you go to almost any intersection in Toronto where two streetcar routes cross, you'll notice there's probably a number of curves of track that allow streetcars to go from one direction to another. Most of these are entirely unnecessary. These complex intersections mean more switches, more complicated maintenance, and more expensive and time-consuming rebuilds, which again, we do a lot of, so we should be trying to make them as short as possible. Now, because so many of these curves of track aren't frequently, if ever, used on a regular basis, they don't have motorized switches, which means even if they are used, the driver or someone else has to actually physically go to the switch and use a big metal stick to move it. This is time consuming, and it's also one of the TTC's justifications for not using dual point switches, because they're heavier and thus harder to move. But making the most important routes less fast and less convenient because there are some switches which you may sometime have to use, maybe in some case, and using them would be more inconvenient if they weren't single point, even though they could still be single point and you could only make the major switches dual point, we still use single point. In Melbourne, there are lots of intersections on their tram network where two routes cross with no connections between the tracks at all. And that's something I'm not actually sure that exists anywhere in Toronto where two routes cross but there are no connecting tracks. There is probably a place, but you can leave it down in the comments below. Now, of course, making these changes, reducing the number of switches, for example, would require more coordination to move streetcars from place to place. But we have a lot of intersections, so even if you leave switches on a few of them, you can still remove a lot of switches. At the same time, another argument for having lots of switches is to allow diversions. But diversions where the streetcar turns, goes up a block, and then goes across a few blocks and comes back down are painfully slow as a rider, so they probably shouldn't be what decides our policy. And, as mentioned before, having streetcars turn with little to no priority is incredibly slow. Given the streetcar network is a rail system, we need to get more consistent about providing the same rail service all the time. And if we can't deliver that, then we should provide a consistent, easy to understand replacement bus service. But all of this needs to be coordinated better so that single routes shut down at a time as much as possible. Oh, and one last thing about the streetcars themselves. Toronto has a cold winter climate and a hot, humid summer climate, and so you would imagine that we frequently use the door buttons on the streetcars, which are designed to allow you to open a single door if only one or two people are getting on or off the streetcar at a given stop, which means that all of the hot air in the winter or all of the cold air in the summer doesn't have to exit the vehicle when you make a minor stop. But in my experience, we basically never use the buttons, and the only time they're actually made use of by riders is to delay the streetcar by pressing it just as the door is closing and then having it reopen so they can hop on. Using the buttons for their intended purpose of keeping most doors closed most of the time would be great, but it's something we just don't do. We could, but we don't. What's crazy about this is I can imagine the excuses. The streetcars are busy, and so it just makes sense to open the doors at every location. And yet when I was in London earlier this year, even on the tube, this is a metro system, they use the door buttons at a lot of stations. And that's something we could decide to do on the streetcars here in Toronto. Going back to right-of-way, we should really have level boarding on the streetcar routes that do have dedicated platforms and a dedicated right-of-way. This is something the LRT lines in Toronto will have, but the streetcar routes don't, and there's no good reason for this. Level boarding is faster and more comfortable for boarding, but it's also more accessible, especially for people using mobility devices. And of course, it's something that Melbourne also does. At the same time as enhancing our stops to add level boarding, we should also consider adding yellow tactile tiles, just as you see on GO train or subway platforms, to help people better distinguish the edge of the platform, for safety and accessibility again. And we don't only need to enhance stops that are on dedicated right-of-ways. We should have a painted area at basically every streetcar stop that shows car drivers where not to stop, so that when you're getting out of your streetcar, you don't have to squeeze between cars, which sucks. At the same time, we can once again look to Melbourne and consider things like raised stop humps, which allow you to have level boarding at a lot of stops even when there isn't a fully dedicated right-of-way. We also should just generally make the stops nicer. There's no good reason that a suburban bus stop that doesn't get a frequent bus service should have a stop that is just as nice as a major streetcar stop that serves thousands of people every day. In Toronto, almost every stop for a bus or streetcar looks identical, but this doesn't actually reflect that some stops get way more use than others and should be larger and have more features. For example, like better ticketing machines and more detailed next transit vehicle arrival screens. It's incredibly frustrating to me, as someone from Vancouver, that a lot of the busiest Vancouver bus stops are much nicer than much more heavily used Toronto streetcar stops. Now, with all of these different ideas put out there, there are also things that we can't just change with signs and redesigns in Toronto. We need policy change. For one, all of these traffic signs and rules are great, but if they're never enforced, which it feels like they rarely are, they're completely meaningless and just a waste of money by putting up signs that no one actually follows. We also need way more careful route management on streetcar lines. Streetcar lines are disproportionately heavily used. They're short and have high ridership, and so the actual streetcars need to be carefully kept at a consistent distance apart, so there's a consistent frequency. Far too often, including on the dedicated right-of-way routes, you'll have no streetcars for 10 or 15 minutes and then 3 in a row. Given this, there's no reason that 2 streetcars on the same route should be leaving the end station one right after the other, because this just worsens the bunching that is already somewhat hard to avoid on a surface route. We should also be trying to make the streetcars faster. Some of that can happen with left turn and through traffic bans, but some of it should also happen through deciding to remove some stops. For example, near U of T, there are stops at both Harbour and Wilcox on the 510 Spadina, despite the fact that these stops are literally like 100 meters apart. Now, when I was in school, I frequently used the Wilcox stop, and so it would personally have hurt me if they didn't have that stop and I had to go to Harbour all the time. But that is the type of decision we actually need to make so that routes are faster and more attractive to everyone. All of these changes are choices, and they're not choices that are necessarily the responsibility of just one group, from the TTC to the City of Toronto to Transportation Services or anyone else. Most of them require more thought and careful coordination, as well as more precision and planning to actually implement them, especially compared to the current solutions we have, if you can call them solutions. But they're just what we need to make our streetcar network something that's actually appropriate for the type of world city Toronto wants to be. And we can start them tomorrow. Thanks for watching.